a grey morning in the old town of Edinburgh, a stonemason named Callum Reid was repointing a wall behind the Royal Mile when his chisel struck something hollow. Behind the masonry, half hidden by centuries of soot, stood a doorway. It had no hinges left, just old oak, swollen and dark, and beyond it, nothing but silence. He called his foreman. Together they worked the stone loose, and there, dropping away beneath their feet, were steps carved straight into the bedrock, descending into a darkness the city's own records seemed to have forgotten entirely. No survey mentioned it. No map showed it. Before we go down there, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. And if these quiet journeys help you drift off, hit subscribe. Because here is the question that will follow us the whole way down. If this space was simply abandoned, why would anyone trouble to brick it shut, sealing it so carefully that 300 years passed before a single soul saw daylight again? Some things, it seems, are not forgotten. They are hidden. And for now, that doorway waits, patient as the stone around it, for us to step through. Edinburgh was never built once. It was built again and again, century stacked on century, and much of the old city simply stayed exactly where it fell. Walk the Royal Mile today, and you are walking a ridge, a long spine of ancient volcanic rock running down from the castle at its head to the palace at its foot. And for hundreds of years, that ridge was the only safe place to build. Beyond it lay marsh and loch and open ground, too soft or too exposed to trust. So the city did the one thing left to it. It grew upward instead of outward, tenement stacked on tenement, 10 stories and more in places, among the tallest domestic buildings anywhere in Europe at the time. All of it crowded onto a single narrow crest of stone, barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass. Off that spine ran the closes and wynds, dozens of them, each a slender stone corridor scarcely broad enough for 2 people to walk shoulder to shoulder, dropping away steeply into shadow on either side of the ridge like ribs from a spine. Some closes took their name from a trade practiced there, some from a family who once held the ground, some from a smell or a rumour that had long outlived whatever gave rise to it. Fishmarket Close carried its own history in its name, and so did Fleshmarket Close nearby, each one a small clue left behind by the trade that once defined it, long after the trade itself had moved on or vanished entirely. They were the city's capillaries, dark and damp and endlessly alive, carrying merchants and washerwomen and hawkers and livestock past doorways that opened straight onto bare stone. And because usable ground was so desperately short, builders in Edinburgh did something that still startles people today when they first hear it. When a new structure was needed, they did not always clear away what had stood before it. They built over it instead. They built through it, layering new floors above old walls the way sediment settles above sediment, so that an entire street, complete with its houses and its stairs, could simply be capped and left standing beneath, intact in the dark, waiting for a day that never seemed to come. Visitors from flatter cities found this arrangement almost impossible to picture. In London, in York, an old wall was cleared before a new one rose. In Edinburgh, on that cramped and stubborn ridge, the old wall often simply became the new one's foundation, its rooms sealed rather than knocked through, its hearths left cold but intact. 10 stories of tenement might therefore rest, unknowingly on the roofline of a much older, much smaller building entirely, and nobody living at the top gave the buried floors below a second thought. This is simply how a city behaves when it has nowhere left to spread. It turns inward and downward, folding its own history under its feet, rather than setting it aside. That is precisely what happened to a narrow lane, once known as Mary King's Close. And, remarkably, it survives to this day, sealed beneath later construction like a held breath under stone. It ran downhill from the Royal Mile toward the loch below, a working street lined with tall, narrow houses that leaned toward one another overhead until the sky above the close was reduced to a thin ribbon of grey. It took its name from a merchant burgess called Mary King, a woman who owned property along its length in the 1600s, and whose name, unusually for the period, was allowed to outlast her. It is a small, telling detail that among all the men who owned the surrounding closes, hers is the name that stuck, carried down through 4 centuries by nothing more than habit and repetition. For a time, the close was simply one more lane among dozens, busy, ordinary, entirely of its own moment, with no sense at all that it was living on borrowed daylight. Then the city changed shape around it. New civic buildings rose across its upper end and along its flanks, grand and municipal, and utterly indifferent to what lay beneath their foundations, and the close was swallowed rather than demolished. Its lower stories, several of its rooms, its worn stone stairs, even its cobbles were left in place, buried under what came after, the way a shell is buried beneath drifting sand without ever quite ceasing to exist. When it was finally reopened to the light, generations later, those who first stepped back into it found something rare. Not a ruin scraped clean by weather and time, but a street held in suspension, a fragment of the old crowded city that had simply stopped being outdoors. The close still runs downhill at its old gradient, its cobbles still cambered to carry water toward the loch that no longer exists above it. Doorways still stand at their old thresholds, though most now open onto solid rock and quarried fill rather than onto neighbouring rooms. Even the air down there behaves as it did once, cool and still and faintly mineral, untouched by wind for longer than anyone can easily reckon. It is, in a very literal sense, a piece of the 1600s that never received the memo that the world above had moved on without it. Before it vanished beneath newer stone, Mary King's Close was a living, working place, and it rewards a moment's pause to picture what that daily life actually looked like. Families occupied single rooms stacked one above another, sharing a common stair that spiraled upward through the gloom like the inside of a shell. A baker might work the ground floor, his ovens breathing heat and the smell of scorched grain into the close from dawn onward, while a wig maker or a metal worker kept a cramped workshop just above him, hammering softly through the afternoon. Higher still, a household might keep hens on a narrow ledge, or spin wool by a window, or mend fishing nets hauled up from the harbour at Leith. Water came from a shared well near the top of the close, carried down in buckets that left a thin, dark trail across the worn cobbles. Waste, unfortunately, often went the other way, tipped from upper windows into the gutter running down the lane's centre, and passers-by learned early to walk briskly and to hug the walls. Candlelight would have flickered behind small shuttered windows well into the evening, throwing long, unsteady shadows against the close's high stone flanks. And voices would have carried oddly in that narrow stone channel, bouncing wall to wall long after the sky above had properly darkened. It was crowded. It was loud in places and strangely hushed in others, and it smelled of tallow and wood smoke, and the cold mineral breath of the rock itself pressing in on every side. On a cold morning, the whole close would have filled with a low haze of chimney smoke, hanging just above head height, before finding its slow way up toward the strip of sky far overhead. None of the people who lived and worked and slept there could have known that their ordinary, unremarkable street was, one day, going to vanish from daylight entirely and become something closer to memory than to place. A merchant's wife might have swept her threshold each morning without ever imagining it would still exist, untouched 400 years later. A child sent to fetch water from the well would have known every uneven cobble by feel alone, the particular dip where rainwater always gathered, the particular stone that always caught a careless toe. These were not grand lives, recorded in any official register beyond a baptism or a burial. They were ordinary lives, lived out in cramped rooms and narrow stairwells. And it is precisely that ordinariness, preserved rather than erased, that makes the close feel less like a monument and more like a household caught mid-breath. And that is the quiet mystery worth carrying forward before we descend any further. How does a living street, full of stairs worn smooth by generations of feet and door frames, darkened by generations of hands, become a buried one rather than simply becoming a ruin? Most old streets in most old cities are eventually torn down in the end, their stones carted away for other uses, their footprint erased and built over with barely a trace left beneath. Mary King's Close was not erased in that way. It was covered instead, the way a hand might be laid gently over a page rather than tearing it free. And something about that particular choice, something about the manner of its slow disappearing, still resists a tidy answer even now. Was it simply practical? A builder's shortcut in a hurry, laying new foundations across old walls because the old walls were already there and already strong enough to bear the weight? Or was there another reason folded into the decision, older and less easily spoken aloud, something closer to caution than convenience? Cities do not usually go to the trouble of sealing a street rather than simply pulling it down. And the closer one looks at the timing of Mary King's Close's disappearance, the harder that timing becomes to explain away as mere expedience. Something happened to this particular corner of Edinburgh, something the old accounts only half describe, and it left the Close's reputation just uneasy enough that burying it rather than clearing it may have felt like the safer course. The ridge above still carries the ordinary hum of the modern city today. Buses idling, footsteps hurrying, gulls calling over the rooftops, while beneath it, only a few feet down through timber and stone, the old close still waits in total darkness, its stairs still climbing toward a doorway that no longer opens onto sky. We will follow that question downward, layer by layer, the same slow and patient way this whole city was built, stone laid quietly upon stone. Before there was a bridge, before there were vaults, before the closes climbed the ridge in their tidy stacked rows, there was water, a loch. Long and dark and shallow at its edges, it lay in the hollow just north of the rock where the castle stood. And for centuries, it did the one job that mattered above all others. It kept people out. Picture it in the year 1450 or thereabouts, when the fortress on its crag was still a working stronghold and not yet a postcard. The loch was not decorative. It was defense made liquid, a moat the size of a small parish, filling the low ground so that any army approaching from the north would have to wade or drown before it ever reached the walls. Soldiers called it useful. Townsfolk called it something closer to a nuisance, because a loch that keeps enemies out also keeps a town's own filth in. And Edinburgh, crowded and rising ever upward along its spine of rock, produced a great deal of filth. Tanners dumped their waste there. So did butchers, and so, in time, did almost everyone with something they wished to be rid of. Until the water carried a smell the old chronicles mention almost in passing, as though it was simply part of the weather. The water grew thick with the years, its surface catching torchlight from the castle above like a sheet of dull pewter. And it is worth pausing here, in the hush of it, on one detail that survives in the old records. They used it, at times, for the drowning of those condemned as witches, tied and lowered into water that had once been the town's only true wall. It is a grim thread, and this is not the moment to follow it far, only to note that it lies coiled beneath the ordinary word loch, the way so much of this city's history lies coiled beneath its ordinary streets. Fishermen worked the loch too, in quieter years, and children are said to have skated its frozen edge in hard winters, unaware or unbothered that the same water had swallowed condemned souls a generation before. That is Edinburgh's oldest habit, really, living calmly on top of what came before, whether it is water, stone, or memory. Garrison ledgers from the fortress mention the loch mostly in passing, as a line of supply or a line of defence, and rarely as a place anyone loved. And yet, for the ordinary households clustered along the ridge above it, the loch was simply there, as unremarkable and as constant as the castle rock itself, present in every childhood and every burial alike. For roughly 300 years, the loch simply sat there, doing its slow work of protection and pollution both. And then, gradually, the world above it changed. By the middle of the 1700s, Edinburgh's leaders had begun to see the water not as a shield, but as a problem waiting for a solution, and drainage began in earnest around 1763, spurred by plans for a new town spreading north across cleaner ground. It did not happen quickly. Draining a loch is not a single afternoon's labour. It is decades of channels cut, sluices opened, silt allowed to settle and dry and settle again. A patient unmaking of something the city had needed for 3 centuries and now needed gone. Workers carted soil down from the digging of the new town's foundations and tipped it into the drained hollow, filling the old lochbed handful by handful, cartload by cartload, until firm ground began to appear where dark water had stood since before living memory. Some of that fill, records suggest, came from the very rubble of collapsed old town tenements, so that a wall which once stood upright above the loch might, within a generation, be lying flat beneath it, buried in its own drained bed, stone lying down where it had once stood proud against the sky. Surveyors of the 1770s noted the smell of the exposed lochbed mud long before they noted its usefulness, thick and mineral and faintly sulphurous, clinging to boots for days after a single crossing. By 1781, the transformation was far enough along that a bridge, the earthen mound, more or less made itself from the sheer volume of dumped earth, rising as an accidental causeway between the old ridge and the new streets to its north. It grew, by some accounts, almost a cartload at a time, an unplanned monument built from nothing more than the refuse of a city, clearing its own throat, cart after cart, load after quiet load. Stand at that spot today and you would never guess a loch had been there at all. The ground feels ordinary underfoot, solid, unremarkable, and that, more than anything, is the quiet trick this city keeps performing on those who walk it, laying calm green gardens over water that once drowned the condemned and fed the fish alike. Even the engineers who oversaw the draining left behind only sparse notes, a few lines in a council minute book, a payment recorded for cartage, as though the erasing of 3 centuries of water deserved no more ceremony than the paving of an ordinary lane. But infill was only half of what changed the shape of Edinburgh below its own feet. Because as the old town grew more crowded through the 1700s, its streets themselves began, almost imperceptibly, to rise. Rubble from collapsed buildings was not always carted away. Ash and midden and broken stone were levelled rather than removed, layer settling upon layer the way silt settles at the bottom of a slow river. And over the decades, the street surface crept upward inch by inch until doorways that had once opened at ground level found themselves half a story below the new pavement. Imagine a merchant's shopfront from, say, 1720, its threshold worn smooth by generations of boots. And now imagine that same threshold, 100 years on, sitting below the level of the cobbles outside, its upper lintel barely level with a pedestrian's ankle. A whole shopfront swallowed by nothing more dramatic than the ordinary passage of time. Nobody demolished these lower stories. It was cheaper, and it was Edinburgh's way, simply to build across the top of them and let the old ground floors become basements, then sub-basements, then rooms that no living tenant had reason to enter at all. Cool air pooled in these buried chambers, even in high summer, carrying the mineral smell of old sandstone and standing damp, a smell that anyone who has stood in a genuine buried close will tell you never quite leaves the nose. Candlelight, when it was carried down there at all, threw long unsteady shadows across walls that had once faced open sky, walls whose upper courses still bore the pale scars of old windows, bricked flush and forgotten. Some of these ground floors were simply forgotten. Others, as later chapters of this city's story will show, were deliberately built over and sealed with clear intent. But the honest truth is that most of what lies beneath modern Edinburgh got there the plain way, through decades of ordinary neglect rather than any single dramatic act. It is an oddly comforting thought in its way. Not everything hidden was hidden on purpose. A stonemason repairing a shopfront in the 1800s might have broken through into one of these forgotten lower rooms without ever suspecting a lock or a plague or a bricked doorway lay anywhere near his work. Only a low, dim space smelling of old sandstone, silent and patient, waiting for a lantern that had not yet arrived. This matters more than it might first seem, because it means the ground beneath the Royal Mile is not one buried world, but several, stacked like the pages of a book nobody thought to number. There is the loch's old bed to the north, quietly holding gardens and railway lines above water that no longer exists. There are the sunken ground floors along the ridge itself, entombed by nothing more sinister than rising rubble, and a city too busy to dig out its own foundations. And there are, as we shall come to, chambers sealed on purpose, doorways bricked with clear intent, spaces meant never to be found again. 3 different centuries, 3 different reasons for burial, and yet all of them sit within a few hundred feet of one another beneath streets that modern visitors cross without a second thought. their footsteps passing directly over water, rubble, and secret in a single unbroken stride. It is tempting to imagine a single grand mystery threading through all of it. One design, one hidden hand, and the truth, gentler and stranger both, is that Edinburgh simply built upward and let the past settle beneath it the way sediment settles in still water. Every age added its layer. Every layer buried the one before it a little more completely, sealing sound and light and memory beneath fresh stone, until what remains on the surface is only ever the newest skin of a much older creature, breathing quietly beneath cobbles that give no sign of what they cover. Walk the length of the mound today, or along Princes Street, where the loch's northern edge once lapped, and nothing in the paving, the grass, or the passing traffic hints at the centuries of water and rubble stacked directly beneath your feet, waiting in the dark for the next layer to be laid on top. And so, if you find that thought unsettling, let it settle instead into something closer to wonder. Because a city built this way keeps its history close rather than losing it, tucked below floorboards and beneath cobbled crossings where no one but the curious ever thinks to look. The loch is gone now, its water traded long ago for gardens and gravel, its drowned centuries folded quietly into the soil beneath the mound, and somewhere beneath the calm modern ground, the older chambers wait exactly where the centuries left them, patient, dark, and entirely undisturbed. Somewhere in that darkness, a doorway still waits to be explained, and the loch, the rubble, and the sealed rooms all share one quiet lesson before we go further. In Edinburgh, nothing is ever truly gone, only covered and covered again, until someone centuries later thinks to look down. 1645 came to Edinburgh the way bad weather comes to a coast, slow at first, then impossible to ignore. The plague had touched the city before, in earlier decades, but this outbreak settled into the old town with an unhurried, almost patient cruelty, moving from close to close along the ridge the city was built upon. Within months, a significant portion of the population had either fled to the fields beyond the walls or shut themselves indoors, hoping thick stone and locked doors might hold the sickness at bay. Those who could afford it left for Musselburgh, for Leith, for whichever farmhouse would still take them in. Those who could not stayed and waited and listened for footsteps in the stair. The city gates themselves were watched more closely than usual that year, guards turning away carts from parishes where the sickness was known to have taken hold. A rough and imperfect cordon drawn around a city that could never fully seal itself off from the world beyond its walls. The town council, no strangers to contagion, responded with the grim, practiced calm of people who had buried neighbours before and expected to again. Officers were appointed to walk the wynds, checking door to door for signs of fever. Physicians were paid to tend the afflicted at real risk to themselves, and at least one is recorded as having died in the attempt. Foul clothes and bedding were burned in the open air, the smoke drifting low over rooftops already dark with peat smoke and tallow, so that the whole ridge for a season seemed to smoulder gently under a grey and watchful sky. Mary King's Close, steep and shadowed even on a bright day, became one of the streets where the illness seemed to linger longest, its narrow stone stair holding the damp long after the sun had cleared the castle rock above it. Chalk marks were left on certain doors, a quiet, official language understood by everyone who lived nearby, needing no explanation and inviting no argument. A cross here, a warning there, a single word, sometimes scratched beneath. Some households were confined entirely, forbidden to step beyond their own threshold while the sickness ran its course within. Their meals and fuel passed to them by hands that did not linger. Bodies, when they came, were carried out at night to spare the living the sight of it. And lime was laid where the dead had lain, the pale dust settling into the stone joints like a kind of hush made visible. It is tempting, looking back across nearly 4 centuries, to imagine Mary King's Close as a place of constant horror during that single terrible year. And yet, the surviving evidence from council minutes and burgh records paints something quieter and far more procedural than the legend that followed. The bureaucracy of plague, as it turns out, was thorough. Wages were recorded down to the shilling. Provisions were logged, sack by sack, cask by cask. Names appear and disappear from the ledgers with the plain, unadorned finality of accounts rather than tragedy. A kind of bookkeeping that somehow makes the loss feel both smaller and, in its quiet accumulation, larger than any single dramatic account could manage. Candles burned late in the council chambers that year, tallow and wax alike, as clerks worked through petitions from families asking for relief, for food, for permission to leave a particular stair. Some petitions survive still, their ink faded to the colour of weak tea, their requests granted or refused in a single terse line beneath, written in a clerk's steady, unremarkable hand. Quarantine in 1645 was not a single measure, but a layered system, built close by close, household by household, as the council learned by hard experience what worked and what plainly did not. Certain entrances into the most affected wynds were sealed with timber, restricting movement so that healthy neighbours could not wander freely among the sick, nor the sick wander freely among the well. Watchmen were stationed at the mouths of the closes, tasked with turning back anyone who tried to leave without leave to do so, a duty that must have felt, on long and quiet nights, both grimly necessary and almost unbearably lonely. Food and fuel were lowered or passed through narrow gaps for households under full confinement, the exchange conducted with as little contact as anyone could manage, coins sometimes left to sit in vinegar before they were touched again. Mary King's Close, threaded through with smaller stairs, hidden landings, and rooms stacked one above another like a small city folded in on itself, made this kind of controlled isolation both easier and harder than a broader street might have allowed. Easier because its layered buildings could be closed off in discrete sections, one stair sealed while its neighbour carried on much as before. Harder because nobody standing outside could ever be entirely certain what was happening within those closed sections. And uncertainty, as it always does, found ways of filling itself in. Neighbouring closes, watching Mary King's from a cautious distance, no doubt traded rumour for fact and back again, each retelling adding a little more shadow to what had, at the time, simply been policy. Later, folklore would seize on exactly that uncertainty and never quite let it go. Stories grew over the generations of entire families locked inside their rooms and left to their fate, of doors nailed shut with the living still trapped behind them, of a close so thoroughly given over to death that no one could bear to walk it afterward without a candle and a companion. It is a vivid picture, and an understandably tempting one for anyone standing at the top of that dim stair centuries later, listening to their own footsteps echo back at them. But it does not sit easily beside what the burgh's own paperwork describes, in its careful, unhurried hand. The records speak, instead of nurses hired to attend the sick within the close, of wages paid to those willing to take on the risk of contagion, of supplies delivered rather than simply withheld out of fear. Quarantine, in the official telling, was strict, often harsh, and sometimes cruel in its practical detail. But it was administered, tracked, and eventually lifted, not abandoned outright and forgotten. That distinction, small as it seems on paper, matters a great deal to anyone trying honestly to understand what happened here. Some of the men appointed to walk the wynds that summer were themselves former residents of the affected closes, chosen precisely because they knew every stair and landing, every family, every door that had never once been painted. Their familiarity made the work bearable, and perhaps made it crueler too, since it meant recognizing names on the lists they carried. Separating the legend from the ledger is not the same thing as dismissing what the plague year genuinely cost the close and the families who endured it. Reasonable estimates suggest that a substantial share of Edinburgh's population perished during the worst outbreaks of the 1600s, and Mary King's Close, densely built and thickly populated even by Old Town standards, would have felt that loss with particular weight, street by street, household by household. Trades that had once filled the close with the ordinary noise of daily life, weaving, smithing, small trading of one kind or another, fell quiet for a season, replaced by the sound of watchmen's boots on stone and the low murmur of prayers said behind closed doors. What the records do not support, however, is the far more dramatic version passed down through later centuries, the tale of a close abandoned wholesale, its dead never properly buried, its living forgotten behind boarded and unopened doors. Burial registers, however incomplete they now appear, show interments continuing steadily through the worst of the crisis, handled with the same solemn, methodical care given to any other year, only faster and in far greater number than usual. The dead of Mary King's Close were carried out, named where the clerks were able, and laid to rest in the ordinary way, not left to rot behind sealed timber, as later legends so often claimed with such confidence. Where the legend does hold a grain of truth is in the atmosphere it captures, rather than the specific details it quietly invents along the way. A close that had endured confinement, chalk marks, and the burning of bedding in open braziers would have carried the memory of that year for a very long time afterward, in the minds of those who survived it, if nowhere else at all. Grief, after all, has a way of settling into stone quite as thoroughly as damp does, and a street need not be haunted in any literal sense to feel, to those who pass through it generations later, as though something quiet and watchful remains. Visitors today, descending the same worn stair by lamplight, often describe a chill that seems to gather somewhere below the 10th step, long before any guide has mentioned the plague at all. Whether that chill belongs to the stone, to the imagination, or simply to the damp Edinburgh air is a question nobody has ever settled, and perhaps nobody truly wants to. That lingering unease, more than any single fact drawn from the Burgh's careful records, may be the truest thread the plague year leaves behind it. Mary King's Close did not stay shut because of 1645 alone, and later chapters of its story would matter just as much. Yet something in that year's memory seems to have shaped how generations afterwards spoke of the place. Softly, carefully, almost reverently, as though naming it too loudly might wake whatever had settled quietly there. Folklore rarely needs a precise cause to take root. It needs only a season of real suffering to work from. And 1645 gave it exactly that. A foundation of genuine hardship onto which later storytellers could patiently build their embellishments, layer upon layer, much as the city itself was built. The close's own history would soon be buried again, this time not by sickness, but by builders and rising streets pressing down from above. And yet the plague year's hush seems to have travelled forward regardless, waiting, patient as chalk fading slowly on a door for the ground itself to shift once more. Whatever else the 1645 records can or cannot confirm, they leave behind a plain enough truth: that a city can carry a hard year quietly in its stones for centuries, long after the last name has been read from the last ledger, long after the candles themselves have gone out. By 1788, Edinburgh had a problem that money and ambition could solve, and the city, restless under its own crowding, chose to solve it with stone. The old town clung to its ridge, narrow and tall, while the new town spread across the valley to the north, elegant and empty, waiting to be joined. Between the two lay a deep dip of ground, the remains of an old marshy hollow, too steep and too soft for an ordinary road. A bridge was the answer, not a modest one, but a grand span that would carry traffic clean over the gap without anyone below ever feeling the difference. The engineers who drew up the plans knew the valley floor lay far beneath the level they needed. So instead of filling it, they decided to build over it, arch upon arch, lifting the roadway high into the air. Construction began that same year, teams of masons working with sandstone quarried nearby, its pale gold catching the low northern light each afternoon. The work was slow and exact, each block set and checked, each arch closed before the next was begun. Workers balanced on timber scaffolding above a drop that would have unsettled lesser men, and more than one mason lost his footing during those months, though the records of exactly how many are thin and inconsistent. What rose above the valley looked, from the street, like an ordinary road lined with fine new buildings, shop fronts and townhouses in a tidy row. Few who walked across it in those early years thought much about what lay beneath their boots. The bridge was meant to be admired from above, a triumph of engineering draped in respectable stonework, and for a time that is exactly how the city saw it. Nobody standing on the pavement guessed that the ground beneath them was not ground at all, but hollow space, chamber after chamber, holding up the weight of the street like a held breath. The project had cost a great deal, more than its promoters first admitted, and the city council argued for years over who should carry the debt once the stonework was finally finished. Trustees were appointed. Tolls were proposed, then quietly abandoned when shopkeepers along the new frontage objected to anything that might slow the flow of customers. Even so, by the time the last arch was closed and the surface paved, most Edinburgh residents considered the bridge a settled fact of the landscape, as though it had always stood there, gathering coal smoke and carriage wheels above a valley few remembered as a valley at all. Few thought to ask what such an enormous structure required underneath in order to stand. To carry that roadway across such a distance, the builders raised 19 great arches, one beside another, marching the full length of the crossing. Each arch was a curve of solid sandstone, thick enough to bear centuries of cartwheels and foot traffic. Yet what those arches created below was almost an afterthought at the time, though it would not stay that way. Between the arches and beneath the road surface, hidden entirely from anyone passing above, ran a honeycomb of vaulted rooms, low-ceilinged and dim, stretching back into the dark like the ribs of something enormous and sleeping. Some chambers were barely large enough for a man to stand upright. Others opened into wider halls where voices carried and echoed. The stonework overhead curved close, damp in places where moisture crept down from the street, and candle smoke over the years left the ceilings black as soot. There was no daylight down there at all, not a single window, only whatever light a lamp or candle could throw across the chalky dust of the floor. The vaults ran in tiers, connected by narrow stairs and low passages, so that a person could move for some distance underground without ever surfacing into the ordinary city above. It was, in effect, a second Edinburgh built inside the bones of the first, sealed within 19 arches that most of the population never thought to question. The air down there carried a particular smell, damp stone and tallow, and something faintly mineral, chalk dust perhaps, or the sandstone itself, slowly breathing moisture into the dark. Engineers at the time likely saw the vaults as simple structural necessity, empty space that came free with the arches holding up the road. But empty space in a crowded city rarely stays empty for long, and Edinburgh, ever short of room, would soon find uses for every hollow beneath the South Bridge. Some chambers, the ones nearest the outer face of the bridge, caught faint daylight through small grated openings cut into the street above, enough to make out shapes, if not colours. Others, deeper in, knew only true dark, the kind that swallowed a candle flame within a few paces and gave nothing back. Masons had shaped the vaults with practical intent, never imagining anyone would linger there for long, and the rough finish of the walls, unplastered, unadorned, told its own quiet story of a space built to bear weight rather than welcome company. Cold seeped from the sandstone even in summer, a stored chill that never quite left. Anyone who spent an hour down among the arches came back up carrying that chill on their skin, a small reminder of how completely those chambers belonged to a world of their own beneath the ordinary city. Merchants were quick to notice what the vaults offered, and within a handful of years of the bridge's completion, those chambers were doing steady, unremarkable work, cool, dry in the better sections, and shielded from weather and thieves alike. The vaults made ideal storage for goods that needed keeping out of sight and out of the damp Scottish air. Wine merchants leased space to lay down casks that needed years of quiet darkness before they were fit to sell. Cobblers and other tradesmen set up small workshops in the drier chambers nearer the street level, hammering leather by candlelight while carts rattled overhead, unseen and unheard by those below. Cheesemongers stored their stock there too, the cool stone shelves suiting the slow ripening that cheese required. For a while, the arrangement suited everyone. The bridge company earned rent from space that would otherwise have gone to waste, and merchants gained cheap, secure premises in the very heart of the city's busiest new crossing. Deliveries came and went through low side entrances built into the arches, doors that opened directly onto side streets below the main roadway, so that goods never needed to travel far from cart to cellar. A boy with a barrow could move casks from a merchant's cart into the vault in a matter of minutes, never once climbing to street level above. Ledgers from those years, where they survive, describe the vaults in dry commercial language. Rents collected, tenants named, disputes over damp goods settled with reluctant compensation. There was nothing sinister in any of it, only the ordinary business of a growing city finding a use for whatever space it could claim. And yet, even in those early respectable years, a thread of trouble was already forming quietly beneath the surface. Water. It seeped through the sandstone more persistently than the builders had accounted for, soaking into stored goods, rotting timber shelving, ruining wine before its time, and turning promising leases into losses. The dampness that had seemed a minor inconvenience in the first seasons began, gradually, to change who was willing to rent the vaults at all. A wine merchant's ledger from those years, quoted long afterward by local historians, complains of casks arriving sound and being drawn up again half-spoiled, the staves swollen and the contents thin with damp. Cheesemongers found their stock softening too quickly, sold before it had ripened as it should. One by one, the tenants who could afford to move their goods elsewhere in the city began doing exactly that, leaving behind chambers that grew steadily harder to let. Landlords, unwilling to see rent altogether lost, lowered their terms to whoever would still take the space. And lower terms, inevitably, drew a different class of tenant than the wine merchants and cobblers who had first signed their names to those leases. What began as an engineering triumph and a modest commercial success would not stay so tidy for long. As the better tenants abandoned the wetter chambers, drifting toward drier premises elsewhere in the city, the vaults were left half emptied, their respectable early tenants replaced, over time, by people with fewer choices and less to lose. The 19 arches that had once symbolized Edinburgh's confident expansion into the modern age would, within a few decades, come to hold a very different sort of population, one the city preferred not to examine too closely. That shift did not happen overnight, and no single document marks the exact turn from storeroom to shelter, from workshop to something altogether more desperate. Historians who have pieced the story together from surviving rent rolls and council minutes describe the change as gradual almost to the point of invisibility. One merchant leaving here, one lease lapsing there, until decades later, almost nobody could say when the vaults had stopped being simply a merchant's convenience. What remained constant through every change of tenant and every falling rent was the darkness itself, patient and unbothered by who came and went above it. But the pattern, once it began, proved difficult to reverse, and the respectable merchants who first filled those chambers with wine and leather and cheese would, in time, be remembered as only the opening chapter of a much longer and stranger story. Rents fell further still in the chambers nearest the lowest, wettest tiers, the ones no wine merchant would touch after the first ruined season. And it was precisely those chambers, cheap and forgotten, that would matter most in the story still to come. For now, though, in those first years after the bridge's completion, the vaults remained simply what they appeared to be. Useful, damp, unglamorous space beneath a handsome new crossing, home to barrels and boots and the quiet hum of ordinary trade. The city above went about its business, unaware, or perhaps simply uninterested in what its own foundations were beginning to hold. Somewhere down in that chalky dark, among the tallow smoke and the slow drip of moisture through ancient stone, the character of the vaults was already starting to turn, one damp season at a time, toward the chapter that would one day make Southbridge famous for reasons its builders never imagined. Rest now, and let the candlelight of that quieter age settle over the arches before the darker years begin their slow arrival. Above, on the bridge itself, carriages rolled past shop fronts lit warm against the evening, and nobody paused to wonder what lay beneath their wheels. Below, in the chalk dust dark, the story of South Bridge was only just beginning to turn its first quiet page. Picture the arches now, not as storage, but as shelter. For once, the merchants moved their crates elsewhere. The vaults did not stay empty for long. Edinburgh's old town was already bursting at its seams by this point in the century. Wynds and closes stacked families, 10 high in tenements that groaned under their own weight, timber floors sagging beneath more bodies than they were ever built to hold. And when the poorest of the poor could find no room above ground, they found it below, in the cold stone throat of South Bridge itself. Rent was cheap here, cheaper than anywhere else in the city, and cheap rent has always meant something was being quietly sacrificed in return. What was sacrificed was light and warmth, and very often health. Entire families crowded into single vaulted chambers no larger than a modest parlour, dividing the space with hung sacking and rough timber partitions, sleeping in shifts because there was not floor enough for everyone to lie down at once. Children were born in these chambers who would not see ordinary daylight until they were carried up into it, blinking, weeks or months old, unfamiliar with the sun. Some accounts speak of a woman who raised 4 children beneath the 9th arch and did not leave the vaults for 11 years together, though no parish record survives to confirm whether that was choice, illness, or simple necessity. The arches did not care either way. They held whoever came, without complaint and without comfort, and the poor of Edinburgh learned, slowly and out of need, to live inside stone that had never once been built for living. A family's whole world might be one arch's width, one hearth of borrowed coal, one door that was really only a curtain strung on a nail. Neighbours in the vaults became a kind of second family by necessity, sharing a single fire between 2 households when coal ran short, passing a sick child from one pair of arms to another through the long hours of a fever. There was little privacy and less choice about it, and yet accounts hint at a rough tenderness that grew in such close quarters, a willingness to mind another's infant while its mother worked, to share bread that could ill be spared. It was not romantic hardship. It was simply hardship, endured with whatever grace the arches allowed. Stone does not soften for anyone, rich or poor, and the families who sheltered under South Bridge knew that better than most who ever wrote about them from a comfortable distance above. Yet the vaults were not only homes, they were workshops too, and the sound down there was rarely silent for long. Cobblers set up benches close to whatever candlelight they could afford, hammering leather soles through nights that had no morning to announce themselves, the tap of hammer on last keeping time long after the shops above had shuttered. A vault might house a shoemaker on one side and a family of 6 on the other, separated only by a hung blanket and the smell of tallow smoke drifting between them. Whiskey was distilled in back chambers, where the excise men rarely thought to look. Illicit stills hissing quietly behind false partitions, built from salvaged crates and packing timber. Taverns opened where taverns were technically forbidden, serving drink to dock workers, caddies, and street vendors who preferred the arch's anonymity to the watchful eye of the street above them. One such tavern, remembered only in fragments passed down by word of mouth, is said to have kept a single lantern burning at its low door as the sole signal that it existed at all. Other trades crowded in beside them, each claiming its own dim corner of stone. A chandler boiled tallow for candles in a chamber thick with animal fat and smoke. A rag merchant sorted cloth by touch alone, fingers reading fabric the way a reader's eyes might move across a page. A butcher cured meat in air that never once moved, hoping the cold of the stone would do what fresh wind could not. Commerce and desperation shared the same low ceiling down there, and business was often done in whispers, because sound carried strangely through stone built to bear the weight of a bridge, not to hold ordinary conversation. It is a curious thought that beneath the polished feet of respectable Edinburgh, an entire second economy hammered and distilled and bartered through the night, unseen, unlicensed, and largely unrecorded by anyone who might have troubled to keep the ledger straight. Whole lives were spent down there in trade, start to finish, and left behind no more than a name half remembered by a neighbour, if that. A boy might be apprenticed to a cobbler in the vaults at 10 years old and never work anywhere else. His whole life, learning the trade by candlelight, the way his master had learned it before him, in the same stone room, at the same worn bench. Custom passed from hand to hand this way, unwritten, unlicensed, and utterly ordinary to those who lived it, even as it would have struck any visitor from the street above as something close to a hidden world. Coins still changed hands down there, just as it did in any respectable shop, though the light by which it was counted was thinner, and the air by which it was breathed was thicker, and no guild ever thought to register a single one of these quiet, subterranean businesses. Above, on South Bridge itself, life carried on in something closer to comfort, almost indifferent to what lay beneath its paving stones. Lamplight lined the street at dusk. Carriages rattled over the cobbles. Merchants displayed their wares behind glass that let in the grey Scottish sky, and passers-by hurried along with scarcely a thought for what their footsteps crossed above. It was, by every outward measure, an ordinary thoroughfare of a thriving and expanding city. Below, the same stone bore a different weather entirely, a climate all its own. No rain touched the vaults, true enough, but neither did any proper wind, and the air inside grew thick and close within hours of a fire being lit for warmth. Damp crept up through floors that had no drainage worth the name, rising steadily, patiently, the way damp always does when given time and stone enough. Moisture beaded on walls that never fully dried between one soaking and the next, dark blooms spreading across surfaces. No candle could keep dry for long. Coal smoke had nowhere to go but into the lungs of those who breathed it, since the vault's only ventilation came from a scatter of small gratings set into the pavement far above, gratings easily blocked by mud, by refuse, or simply by neglect over passing seasons. Candles guttered for want of proper air, and those who lived below learned to measure the hours by how the flame behaved rather than by any clock or bell. Sickness moved quickly in conditions like these, spreading between chambers that shared walls but rarely shared fresh air, and children were the ones who paid for it most often, their small chests the first to struggle. A doctor visiting the vaults, in testimony recorded years later, described the smell alone as enough to turn a strong man's stomach at the threshold. Yet he noted, almost in passing, that those who lived there no longer seemed to notice it at all. The body adapts to what it cannot escape. That, perhaps, is the quietest tragedy of the whole arrangement, not the damp itself, but how ordinary the damp eventually became to those who had no other air left to breathe, no window, no field, no memory of anything cleaner. Even sound behaved differently down there than it did in the open street. Footsteps on the pavement above arrived as a dull, distant thud felt through the stone before it was properly heard, so that those living in the vaults grew used to the city passing over their heads, like weather they could feel but never see. A cart's wheels, a hurried errand, a burst of laughter outside a tavern door. All of it filtered down, changed, softened, made strange by the thickness of stone in between. Some who lived there claimed they could tell the hour of the day from these muffled sounds alone, long before any clock told them so, reading the rhythm of the street above the way a sailor might read the sea. And yet, for all its crowding, all its coughing candlelight and hammering cobblers, this underground world left behind astonishingly little trace of itself. No detailed census counted the families room by room, chamber by chamber. No newspaper thought the arches worth more than a passing disapproving mention, and that mention was usually written by someone who had never once climbed down to see them for himself. The names of the cobblers, the tavern keepers, the mother who raised her children in darkness beneath the 9th arch, went largely unrecorded, swallowed by the very stone that had sheltered them for so long. Parish ledgers noted births and deaths without always noting where those lives had actually been lived. And so an entire neighborhood, breathing and working and grieving beneath the bridge, slipped quietly out of the official record, even while it still existed in fact, when conditions in the vaults grew notorious enough to trouble the city's conscience. The response was not restoration, but concealment. And one by one, the openings that let people down into that world would soon be closed against them for good. But before the walling began, something else happened first. Something quieter and stranger than any official closure. There were reports, murmured rather than published, of figures glimpsed in the vaults who did not seem to belong to any of the families known to live there, seen clearly in one telling and entirely absent in the next, as though the dark down there kept its own guests besides the living. Whether that was rumour born of poor light and poorer drink, or something else entirely carried in the damp air alongside the coal smoke, no one troubled to write down or explain. The vaults simply grew quieter with each passing year, not because life inside them ended all at once, but because the surface above slowly stopped looking down to check on what it had built over. A world can vanish from memory long before it vanishes from the earth beneath a city's feet. And Edinburgh's vaults would prove that truth in the driest, coldest way imaginable, waiting patiently in the dark for a memory that no longer came looking for them at all. What lingers, oddly, is not the disapproval of those who wrote the arches off, but the quiet persistence of the people who lived their whole ordinary lives inside them, unbothered by how history would later choose to frame their home. They cobbled shoes, poured drinks, raised children, and endured one candle at a time in a darkness the rest of the city preferred not to think about. That thread of a whole community slipping unnoticed out of the record while the stone above it stood exactly as before, is one this story is not finished telling. Beneath the crowded pavements of the old town, where tourists now shuffle past souvenir shops and closes that smell of rain and old stone, there once stood a friary built for silence. The Black Friars came to Edinburgh in the 1200s, Dominican monks in dark habits who chose the slope running down toward the loch for their new home. Their monastery rose close to where the Cowgate now runs, a cluster of chapel, cloister and dormitory, hemmed in by orchards and a modest wall. It was not a fortress. It was a place of study and prayer, of candlelight moving slowly across vaulted ceilings, while the city outside went about its noisier business. For nearly 3 centuries it stood there, largely unnoticed by the chroniclers who preferred to write of kings and sieges. The friars kept their own quiet rhythm. Bells for prayer, bells for meals, the scratch of a quill on vellum in a scriptorium warmed by little more than breath and hope. Pilgrims sometimes stopped at its gate, seeking blessing or simply shelter from the wind that came hard off the firth. Local families brought their dead to be remembered in the friary's prayers, believing that a stone marker and a monk's whispered name might carry a soul more gently into whatever came next. The building itself grew slowly, extended by donations, by the labor of masons who left their initials carved quietly into corners no one was meant to see. Sandstone was hauled up from quarries beyond the city, cut and dressed by hands that never expected their work to vanish. Some records suggest the friary held a library of modest size, manuscripts copied and recopied, their margins filled with small drawings that meant something only to the monk who made them. Winters here were long, and the loch below would freeze at its edges while the friars kept to their cells, breath visible in the cold air of the chapel at dawn prayer. Visitors from outside the city sometimes remarked on how ordinary it all seemed, expecting grandeur and finding instead plain stone and quiet routine. That plainness, though, was its own kind of devotion, built not for show, but for endurance. Occasional burials took place within the friary grounds, and a handful of stone markers, weathered almost smooth, were said to bear names no living person could any longer read. There were rumours, even then, of a passage said to run beneath the cloister toward the burg wall, though no surviving document confirms it, and the friars themselves left no explanation behind. It was, by every account that survives, an unremarkable religious house doing unremarkable religious work. And perhaps that is precisely why so little was written about it while it stood. History tends to notice buildings only at the moment of their ruin, and the Blackfriars would have their moment soon enough. Its bell, cast sometime in the 1400s according to a single surviving mention, was said to carry clearly across the loch on still mornings, calling the faithful before the rest of the town had properly woken. Few of those who heard it could have imagined the building falling silent so completely within their own lifetimes, its bell melted down or simply lost. For now, though, in this telling, let it simply exist. Let the candles burn low in their sconces. Let the frost settle on the cloister garden in winter, and let the bells ring out over a city that barely paused to listen. Then came the Reformation, and with it a fury that swept through Scotland's religious houses like weather no one could turn back. By the middle of the 1500s, the old certainties that had sustained places like the Blackfriars were being publicly and violently questioned. Reformers preached against what they called the excesses of the old church, against relics and incense, and the quiet authority of monks who answered to Rome rather than to the new order rising in Scotland. Edinburgh's mobs, stirred by sermons and by years of resentment, did not wait for official sanction. In the year 1559, as reforming sentiment reached its boiling point across the country, the friary was attacked and largely destroyed. Accounts describe crowds moving through religious houses across the city, stripping altars, breaking windows, carrying off whatever could be carried, and burning what could not. The Blackfriars Monastery, once a place of careful silence, became instead a site of noise and smoke and falling masonry. Stone that had been laid with patience came down in an afternoon. Whatever library the friars had kept was scattered or lost, its pages perhaps used as kindling by hands that no longer valued what was written on them. It is worth pausing here, gently, on what such destruction actually meant for the people involved. The friars themselves, many of them elderly, were turned out with little more than what they wore. Some found shelter with sympathetic families. Others simply disappear from the record, their names never mentioned again in any surviving document. The site itself, blackened and half-ruined, sat for a time as a kind of open wound in the city's fabric, a visible reminder of how quickly an old world could be dismantled. Smoke was said to hang over the Cowgate for days afterward, thin and grey, curling past windows where families watched in silence. Some later accounts, written decades on and coloured by their own sympathies, claimed the friars had buried certain valuables before the mob arrived, small chests of silver or documents hidden somewhere within the grounds. No such cash was ever recovered, at least not in any record that survives. The claim may be nothing more than the kind of story a ruined building tends to attract. Still, it lingered in local memory for generations, whispered by those who passed the rubble and wondered what exactly lay beneath their own feet. Building materials rarely go to waste in a city as tightly built as Edinburgh, and it was not long before local residents and builders began quietly helping themselves to the fallen stone. Cut sandstone blocks, expensive to produce and now simply lying free for the taking, found their way into garden walls, into the foundations of new townhouses, into the footings of buildings that had no memory of what they were built from. The friary did not vanish so much as it was redistributed, piece by piece, into the ordinary fabric of the growing town. What could not be carried away was often simply left, buried under rubble that later generations would build straight over without a second thought. By the time the 17th century arrived, most Edinburgh residents walking the Cowgate would have had little idea a friary had ever stood nearby. The city's relentless need for space did what time so often does in Edinburgh. It built over the past rather than clearing it away. Cellars belonging to later merchant houses were dug straight into the old monastic foundations, sometimes without the builders even realizing what lay beneath their spades. Fragments of worked stone, clearly older and finer than anything being produced locally at the time, turned up in cellar walls and were simply left in place, load-bearing now rather than sacred. A section of vaulted ceiling, unmistakably ecclesiastical in its proportions, became part of the undercroft of a merchant's warehouse, its Gothic curve hidden behind stacked barrels and crates. Later still, as the Cowgate thickened with tenements and the poor crowded into whatever space the wealthier classes abandoned, these old chambers took on new and humbler purposes. Storage, overflow housing. In at least one case, a section of former friary wall reportedly formed part of a tavern's back room, its worn stones slick with damp and candle smoke. Its original purpose entirely unknown to the drinkers who leaned against it each night. Antiquarians in later centuries, digging through old charters and property deeds, began piecing together just how much of the friary survived in this hidden, absorbed way. One 19th century researcher, cross-referencing old title deeds against surviving cellar plans, claimed to have identified 3 separate properties whose foundations very likely rested on friary stonework, though he was cautious enough to admit he could not be entirely certain. His notes describe damp air in one such cellar, a coolness that seemed to hold even in summer, and a faint smell he could only describe as candle wax, long since gone cold. Whether that was memory or simply mildew, no one can now say. Not as a ruin one could visit, but as a scattering of fragments embedded inside the city's later structures, present but unseen, load-bearing but unacknowledged. When workmen in more recent times have broken through certain cellar walls in the area, they have occasionally found dressed stone with mason's marks that match no known later building, a quiet signature from hands long since gone. It is a strange kind of survival, this business of a sacred building becoming, without ceremony, the bones of ordinary commerce. No plaque marked it. No memory was kept of it, beyond a few lines in old church records and the occasional puzzled note from a builder who found something he could not quite explain. This, in truth, is simply how Edinburgh treats its past, again and again, layer folding quietly over layer. The friary's disappearance was not an isolated accident, but part of a pattern the city seems almost compelled to repeat. Just as the vaults beneath South Bridge would later be sealed away and forgotten, just as whole streets would eventually be built directly over the closes that came before them, the Blackfriars simply joined a long procession of buildings, absorbed rather than remembered. Edinburgh rarely demolishes cleanly and starts fresh. It tends instead to bury, to build atop, to let one century's walls become the next century's foundations without pause for ceremony or record. There is something almost thrifty in it, this refusal to waste good stone, even while forgetting entirely what that stone once meant. It happened with the friary. It would happen again with the vaults, and again with whole streets given over to newer, grander plans above them. And there is something quietly unsettling too, in knowing that so much of what the city now stands on was once something else altogether, something with its own purpose and its own names, now lost. Somewhere beneath a modern building on or near the Cowgate, fragments of vaulted ceiling likely still rest in darkness, holding up walls that have no idea of the prayers once said beneath them. No one has excavated the full extent of it. No one may ever choose to. Perhaps that is simply the city's way of keeping faith with what it buries, leaving certain things undisturbed rather than dragging them, unwilling, into the light. It remains one small thread in a much larger tapestry the city keeps drawing over itself, a habit of concealment that this telling will return to again before the night is through. For now, let the friary rest where it has rested for centuries, unlit and unbothered, its old stone doing new work in the dark, its history folded so deep into the fabric of the town that most who pass above it will never once suspect it is there. Consider for a moment why a city would choose to close a door rather than open one. By the middle of the 19th century, Edinburgh's magistrates had a tidy explanation, ready for anyone who asked about the vaults beneath South Bridge. The chambers were structurally unsound, they said, damp with the seep of centuries, their sandstone ribs softened by water that found its way down through 19 arches, never meant to bear so much weight above them. Sanitation was the other word used, again and again, in the reports that survive. Fever lived in such places, the officials wrote, and fever was a civic problem, long before it was a personal tragedy. Cholera had already swept through the closes more than once, carried on bad water and worse air, and and no one in a position of authority wanted their name attached to the next outbreak. So the paperwork reads plainly enough: close the vaults, seal what cannot be maintained. Let stone settle back into darkness where no lamp need follow it. And on paper, that is simply prudent housekeeping, the kind any growing city might undertake without a second thought. The reasoning was not invented from nothing either. Bridges of that era did settle unevenly, and chambers built into a slope of rubble, and old foundations did flood when the weather turned, candle smoke and coal smoke thickening in passages with no proper vent to the surface above. A magistrate signing an order to brick up an entrance could point to genuine cracks in genuine stone, to genuine reports of illness among those still sheltering there, and feel entirely justified in doing so. There was, after all, a certain civic pride in tidiness by this period, a growing sense that a modern city ought not to advertise the crowded, damp chambers still tucked beneath its finer bridges and terraces. Better, the thinking seemed to run that such places simply ceased to exist in the public mind, walled away rather than reformed, forgotten rather than repaired. Yet listen closely to how often the same phrases repeat, almost word for word, across different decades and different hands. And you begin to sense a story being smoothed rather than merely told. A structural note here, a sanitary concern there, rarely a name, rarely a single voice explaining what, precisely, had been found down among the collapsed masonry and the packed earth floors before the masons arrived with their barrows of rubble. Committee minutes from the period, where they survive at all, tend toward a kind of studied brevity, as if the clerks writing them had been instructed to record the outcome and little of the reasoning behind it. A vault is noted as unsafe. A sum is approved for its closure. The next entry moves briskly onto matters of drainage elsewhere in the burg, as though the chamber in question had never held a single soul, nor a single lamp, nor a single argument about whether it truly deserved to be sealed at all. That brevity, more than anything else, is what invites a second look now, generations later, from anyone willing to read the surviving paper against the surviving memory. The physical work of sealing began gradually, then all at once, the way such civic decisions often do. Through the 1830s and into the 1850s, entrance after entrance along the vaulted closes was bricked, one small doorway of stone swallowed by another wall of stone, until a visitor walking the length of the bridge above would have had no reason to imagine anything beneath their feet at all. Workmen carried candles into passages that had once held families, hawkers, illicit stills, and whatever else the city's poorest had improvised in the dark. They measured, they built, they left, and the pace of that work quickened noticeably as the decades wore on, as though patience for the old chambers had finally run out. Whole sections of the old town's closes, not just the famous vaults themselves, were treated the same way during this period, buried beneath later construction as street levels rose and new facades were raised across the slope running down from the Royal Mile. A close that had opened onto daylight a generation earlier might, within a few short years, become nothing more than a blocked recess behind a tenement wall, its name surviving only in a rent roll or a rate book somewhere in the city archive. Children playing above such spots would sometimes speak of a coolness rising through the cobbles on warm afternoons, a faint mineral chill that had no obvious source, though grown ears rarely paid such talk any mind. Mary King's Close, tucked further along that same hillside, had already been partially closed off generations earlier, and its later absorption beneath municipal buildings only continued a habit the city seemed unable to break. Brick by brick, close by close, Edinburgh quietly rewrote its own ground floor, layer settling upon layer, the way chalk settles beneath a slow tide. Ledgers note dates of closure, the names of the overseers, the cost of the labour in shillings and pence, carefully itemised beside entries for lime and timber and cartage. What they rarely note is what became of the people still living there when the walls went up, nor whether every chamber was checked before the final course of brick sealed it from the world above, nor who, if anyone, walked the length of each passage with a lamp raised before giving the order to close it for good. Some closures took place quietly, over a single week, with no fanfare beyond the scrape of trowel against brick. Others dragged on for months, held up by disputes over cost, over ownership, over who exactly bore responsibility for a chamber that no longer appeared on any current lease. In the gaps between those disputes, it is easy to imagine other business being conducted in the dark, unrecorded and unremarked, before the final wall went up and made the question moot for the next 3 centuries. A single missing page in an otherwise thorough ledger can hide a great deal, and more than one such page, curiously, seems to be missing from precisely the years this bricking up was at its busiest. And this is where the official record begins to fray at its edges, however carefully it was kept. Structural collapse and cholera explain a great deal, certainly, and no one need doubt that both were real and pressing concerns for a city built in such crowded layers upon chalk and rubble and old plague pits. But local testimony, passed down in a manner far less orderly than any council minute, tells a slightly different story, one with gaps the tidy version does not have. Residents spoke of vaults sealed with unusual haste, of certain sections closed off before their neighbours, of workmen who would not say precisely what they had uncovered before laying the final bricks. A candle left burning where no one now lived. A sound, some said, carried faintly up through packed earth on quiet nights, long after the doorway above had vanished into the wall around it. Old men in the taverns near the bridge told younger listeners of a mason who refused further work in one particular vault, and who would give no clear reason beyond an unwillingness to return. Whether such stories began as truth or grew into something larger with each retelling, no one now can say with certainty, and perhaps that uncertainty is itself the point worth sitting with. A washerwoman who worked the closes above the vaults in her youth was said, decades later, to have refused ever to walk that particular stretch of pavement after dark, though she would never quite explain why, only that the stone beneath her feet felt somehow attended to, as though something below had simply been asked to wait rather than to leave. Such testimony carries no weight in any court, and rightly so, yet it persisted for generations regardless, passed from one fireside to the next, long after the woman herself had died. None of this appears in the surveyor's report. None of it needed to, if the surveyor's task was only ever to note subsidence and damp. Still, the distance between what was written and what was whispered has never entirely closed, and it is worth sitting with that distance rather than rushing past it, the way we so often rush past anything unresolved, anything that resists a tidy shape. History, after all, is rarely as tidy as the ledgers pretend, and a city built in layers upon layers of its own stone will always hold more than its official pages can hold. Perhaps that is simply how cities behave when they grow too quickly over ground already crowded with the dead and the difficult. They wall off what troubles the tidy record and call it hygiene, call it engineering, call it progress, and in most cases they are probably right to. A city cannot function with fever loose in its foundations, nor with bridges crumbling beneath the weight of the streets they carry. And so the bricklayer's work was, by any reasonable measure, necessary. Yet somewhere in those bricked doorways along South Bridge, in those closed sections of the old town pressed down beneath newer stone, an official explanation sits beside an unofficial memory, and the two were never quite reconciled. No inspector's ledger says who, if anyone, was left behind when the last brick went in. No minute records what the workmen actually found in the deepest chambers before they turned away with their tools, nor why certain vaults were sealed within days while others waited years for the same treatment. It is a curious thing, when you consider it, that a city so careful in its rate books and its rent rolls should be so casual about the human detail of who lived, worked, and perhaps died within stone it was actively burying. Perhaps that carelessness was simply the temper of the age, a 19th century impulse to move forward and not look back too closely at what progress required. Perhaps it was something more deliberate. The surviving paper offers no clear verdict either way, and that absence of a verdict is, in its own quiet fashion, as telling as any confession might have been. The record, for all its careful dates and careful language, is an incomplete one, and incomplete records have a way of waiting patiently in the dark, undisturbed, for someone eventually to come looking. For 300 years, more or less, that is exactly what these chambers did, walled shut beneath a city that walked above them without a thought, candle soot still faint on their ceilings, bones of old fires cold in their corners, waiting through 100 winters, then 200, then very nearly 3, patient in a way that only stone and darkness can truly be, until curiosity, as it always does in time, found its way back down. For nearly 2 centuries, almost nobody spoke of what lay beneath South Bridge at all. The silence was not accidental, or at least it did not feel accidental to those who later tried to trace its edges. It was the kind of silence a city builds when it would rather forget an entire floor of itself than maintain it, brick by brick, decade after decade, until forgetting becomes easier than remembering ever could be. Somewhere around 1985, a former rugby player named Nor Loch bought a pub called the Tass, tucked close to the bridge's old stone flank, its cellar walls damp in the way old Edinburgh cellars always are. It was there, quite by accident, that the thread of the vaults found its way back into daylight. A leak, a damp patch spreading slowly across plaster that had held for generations. A contractor sent down simply to trace where the water was getting in, nothing more ambitious than that. What he found instead was a void behind the cellar wall, cold air moving where no air should have moved, carrying with it a mineral chill that had nothing to do with the pub above. Beyond that gap in the stonework lay chambers that had not felt human breath in longer than anyone could say with any real certainty. The contractor, by most accounts, did not linger long that first evening. He reported what he had found, sealed the hole loosely against the weather, and left the rest to daylight. Even so, Word of a hidden void beneath a working pub cellar travels quickly in a city built so thoroughly on top of itself. Rowan did not rush in, and in hindsight, that patience feels almost fitting. He waited, as people so often do when a discovery feels larger than the moment allows for, larger than a single evening's curiosity can hold. Word moved quietly among a small circle before wider attention followed. It would be 1988 before serious exploration began in earnest. Torches carried low along passages nobody living had walked, and 1994 before the vaults beneath South Bridge were properly reopened to the public at large. 9 years passed between that first crack of daylight and the first paying visitor stepping carefully across the threshold. 9 years of careful surveying, of shoring up unstable sections, of deciding what the public should be shown and what should remain, for now, undisturbed. Funding arrived in fits and starts, as it so often does for projects nobody quite knows how to categorize. Part heritage work, part archaeology, part simple curiosity about a city talking to itself across 300 years. That gap alone tells you something about how careful, how quietly deliberate the whole rediscovery truly was. Nobody threw the doors open overnight. Everybody involved seemed to sense that this was not simply an attraction waiting to be unveiled, but something closer to an inheritance that needed handling with both hands. Engineers checked ceiling stability room by room before a single visitor was permitted through. Archaeologists catalogued what they could without moving it, aware that the value of the find lay partly in its stillness. Even the press, when it finally arrived, was kept at a careful distance for a time, as though the vaults themselves needed a slow, gentle introduction back into the world above. Before Rowan's leak, before the torches and the survey teams and the eventual queues of visitors, there had been almost total public silence about the vaults for the better part of 100 years. Older Edinburgh residents might recall a story passed down from a grandfather, some half-remembered mention of tunnels beneath the bridge. But such tales carried the soft unreliability of folklore rather than the weight of documented fact. Official records were thin, thinner than they had any right to be for a structure of that scale. Council minutes referenced the vaults only obliquely, and only ever in the dry language of structural liability rather than human history, as though the safest way to handle an uncomfortable inheritance was to describe it in terms so administrative that nobody would ever ask a harder question. No guidebook of the 1890s mentioned them by name. No newspaper of the 1920s thought them worth even a passing column. It was as if the city, having sealed the entrances a century before, had also sealed the subject itself, somewhere deep in the collective memory of everyone living above. Historians who later went looking for continuous documentation found gaps instead of records. Decade-sized gaps, stretches of years where the vaults simply were not discussed in any surviving civic paper at all. A structure holding perhaps hundreds of chambers, built directly into the foundations of a major thoroughfare, had somehow slipped from public consciousness almost entirely, as thoroughly as if it had never been built at all. Tour guides working the streets above in the early 20th century apparently knew nothing of what lay beneath their own roots, and shopkeepers whose cellars backed onto sealed vault walls rarely thought to ask what lay past the brick. That is not the natural fate of a landmark. Landmarks get remembered, even ruined ones, even shameful ones, even those a city would rather not claim. This one did not join that company. This one simply vanished from conversation, And the reason for that stubborn, near-total quiet remains, even now, only partly explained by anyone who has studied it. When the first survey teams finally climbed down through Rowan's opened wall, they did not find empty stone rooms waiting patiently, swept clean for eventual visitors. They found the vaults, much as the last people to leave them had left things, undisturbed for the length of a century or more, exactly as abandonment had shaped them. Rubble had settled into low drifts across some floor sections, a slow sediment of collapsed brick and forgotten mortar, accumulating undisturbed year upon year. Beneath it, when the surveyors moved carefully, ordinary objects began to surface. Broken pottery shards, the curved fragment of a clay pipe stem, a scrap of leather sole worn thin by feet that had walked those same passages generations before any camera arrived to record them. In one chamber, low soot marks streaked the stone above where a lamp or a small fire must once have burned through some long-forgotten night. That char was still faintly bitter on the air when researchers first breathed it in. A smell like old ash mingled with damp sandstone, and something colder underneath that no one could quite put a name to, no matter how long they stood there trying. Elsewhere, entire sections of passage had partially collapsed inward, ceiling stones sagging into rooms nobody had reinforced since the vaults first went dark, and surveyors moved through those corridors with a caution bordering on reverence. Fragments of clay pipe turned up again and again, scattered across several chambers as though smoking had been one of the few comforts available down there. In a corner of one room, a small cluster of glass bottles sat undisturbed, their necks thick with a century of dust, arranged almost neatly enough to suggest someone had once meant to come back for them. Nothing gleamed in those chambers. Nothing announced itself as treasure in the way visitors half hoped it might. What the vaults offered instead was texture, the quiet residue of ordinary lives lived out in extraordinary conditions. Cobblers and tradesmen who had once rented these underground rooms as workshops, and in leaner years, as makeshift homes when nothing better could be found above ground. A child's shoe was among the finds, small enough to fit a single hand, its leather curled and blackened by decades of relentless damp. Nobody could say whose foot it had once warmed, or why it had been left behind at all. A few paces further on, a length of frayed rope hung looped over an iron hook, still holding its knot after all those silent years, as though someone had simply set it down mid-task and never returned to finish. Small details like these accumulate quickly once you start noticing them, each one a fragment of a life interrupted rather than concluded. Taken together, they read less like ruin and more like a room someone stepped out of for a moment, fully intending to come straight back. Chalk marks lingered faintly on one wall, perhaps a tally, perhaps a measurement scratched by candlelight, or perhaps nothing more than a bored hand passing time in the dark centuries ago. The vaults had not been cleaned before sealing. They had simply been closed, as though whoever gave that final order wanted the rooms preserved exactly as they stood, rather than emptied with any care, any ceremony, any acknowledgement of the lives that had passed through them. That detail, more than any other single fact, is the one worth sitting with as the tour lights click off somewhere behind you. Cities do not usually seal a space and leave its contents entirely untouched unless something about haste or discomfort or plain indifference outweighed the ordinary impulse to tidy up first. The structural and sanitary reasons cited generations earlier explain, well enough on paper, why the entrances were bricked shut in the first place, and no serious historian doubts that damp and instability played some genuine part in that decision. But paper explanations rarely account for everything. They do not fully explain why the objects inside were left exactly where they lay, gathering dust in the dark for 100 years. They do not explain why the subject vanished so completely from public record, as if by unspoken agreement rather than simple oversight. Was it embarrassment, some collective wish to bury the memory of poverty that had sheltered there? Was it simple neglect, the ordinary drift of a city's attention toward newer, brighter concerns rising above ground? Or was it something closer to reluctance, an unspoken understanding among those who knew the vaults best, that certain rooms are better left to settle quietly back into the stone that made them in the first place? 1994 gave Edinburgh its floor back, chamber by careful chamber, brick by patient brick. But it could not give back the reasons for the long silence that came before it. That answer, if it truly exists at all, still waits somewhere in the dark beneath the bridge, patient as the dust that never quite finishes settling, and patient too as everything else this city has chosen over the centuries to leave unsaid. Perhaps that is the truest lesson of 1994. Some rediscoveries answer every question they raise. Others simply hand you better questions and ask gently that you carry them forward into whatever comes next beneath these old streets. Before the close could be opened to the public, it had to be opened to the archaeologists first, and that work moved the way all careful work moves, in small increments in the dust. Surveyors came down with tape measures and torches long before any visitor was let past the barrier. They mapped what the vaults had kept for them, room by room, level by level, noting where 19th century floors sat directly above the older street. Every wall was photographed before a single stone was touched. Every layer of grime was treated as evidence rather than dirt to be swept away. The team worked slowly because the close would only give up its record once. Plaster was tested, timber was sampled, soot on the ceilings was left in place, since even soot has a story to tell about what once burned below it. The survey took years, not months, and it produced maps that finally let historians say, with some confidence, whose home had stood where. Each chamber was given its own number, its own file, its own careful drawing, so that nothing found later could be muddled with anything found before. Conservators worked in short shifts, since the air below was thick and the light was poor, and fatigue in that setting made careless hands. A single misplaced footstep could crush a fragment that had survived 3 centuries undisturbed, so every boot was watched, every movement slow and deliberate, every hand gloved before it reached for anything the dust had kept. What surprised the surveyors most was how much had simply been left, untouched, as though the last people to leave had meant to come back for it. Nothing about the underground street had been staged for a modern eye. It had only been sealed and forgotten, and that forgetting had preserved it in a way that careful curation rarely manages. The archaeologists moved through the close, the way a listener might move through an old letter, reading not for the grand event, but for the small, telling detail folded into the margin. Reports written at the time describe a peculiar hush that settled over the survey teams as the weeks went on. A sense that they were not excavating ruins so much as trespassing gently on a household that had simply stepped out. And it was in those margins, ledger by ledger, room by room, that Mary King's Close began to speak again after 3 long centuries of silence. Later, once the survey drawings were compared against old city records, a handful of names began to reattach themselves to specific rooms. Tenants and tradesmen pulled gently out of anonymity by patient cross-referencing. It was slow work and inexact, but it mattered, because a name changes how a room is heard. A weaver here, a candlemaker there, a widow who kept lodgers in 3 low rooms near the foot of the close. Her name faint in a rent ledger, her hearth still cold and waiting. 2 floors beneath a modern street she would never have imagined. Among the first things the survey confirmed were the fireplaces, low and blackened, still built into the stone exactly where the original tenants had left them. Ash sat cold in more than one hearth, undisturbed since the day the fire was last banked for the night. Some grates still held fragments of coal, dense and dark, waiting for a hand that would never return to strike it alight again. A soot line above one mantel traced the exact height a low fire had burned for years, the household's habits written plainly into the stone itself. The thresholds told their own quiet history. Stone steps were worn into shallow curves by feet that had climbed them thousands of times before the street above ever rose to bury them. You could stand in a doorway and feel through the leather of a modern boot the hollow where centuries of ordinary comings and goings had worn the stone thin. One threshold in particular carried a groove so deep that surveyors could only explain it as decades of a single cart or a single barrow dragged across the same worn line day after day. Domestic items turned up in places that suggested haste rather than ceremony. A shoe, cracked and small, was found tucked beneath a stair. Pottery shards, some still glazed a dull green, lay scattered near a hearth, as though a meal had been interrupted rather than finished. A child's toy, carved crudely from wood, was recovered from a corner where dust had gathered undisturbed for generations. A clay pipe, its stem snapped, lay near a doorway as though set down for only a moment and never lifted again. None of it had been arranged for effect. It had simply stayed because no one had come to move it. Wooden shelving, half rotted, still clung to one wall, and on it sat the pale outline of jars, long since crumbled to nothing but a stain. Nails remained hammered into beams that had once held washing, or tools, or a lantern for the evening. A length of rope, brittle now, still hung looped over one such nail, its purpose long forgotten, but its knot still tied. Even the smell of the place carried something of that ordinary permanence, the damp mineral breath of stone that has never known open sky, mixed faintly with old smoke and older candle wax. It is a smell that settles into memory quickly and does not leave it, and more than one visitor since has said the same thing, that the smell alone made the centuries feel suddenly uncomfortably close. A washing line, long rotted to fragments, still crossed one low room from wall to wall, evidence of laundry hung to dry in air that never once saw sun. Small things like that, ordinary and unremarkable anywhere else, felt weighty here, simply for having survived at all. Taken together, the fireplaces and the worn thresholds and the small forgotten objects built a picture far quieter than any legend could offer. This was not a stage set for tragedy. It was a street where people had lived out unremarkable days, cooking, mending, minding children, banking their fires each night before sleep. The chalk marks on one wall, faint numerals from a tally long abandoned, suggested rent owed or goods counted, the small arithmetic of survival rather than anything more dramatic. A comb, its teeth broken but its handle smooth from years of use, spoke to a morning routine repeated without thought, the way any of us might run a comb through our hair without once considering the centuries ahead. A stub of candle, half consumed, sat in a niche carved for exactly that purpose. Evidence of an evening spent reading or sewing, or simply waiting out the dark by a small and steady flame. The evidence, read plainly, described lives built from repetition, warmth sought at a hearth, thresholds crossed and crossed again, small belongings kept close because little else was owned. Families here were tailors, wig makers, brewers, servants to the wealthier households above, and the debris of their trades turned up alongside the debris of their meals. Offcuts of leather beside fish bones, a broken awl beside a cracked cup, a spool of thread beside a shard of window glass, no thicker than a fingernail. It is easy, from a distance of 300 years, to imagine only darkness and dread in a place sealed and forgotten. But the physical record argued for something gentler, a household rhythm that continued for as long as it could. Candlelight against sandstone, footsteps on worn stone stairs, a fire kept low but rarely let go out entirely. Children's footprints, small and light, were later identified in a hardened patch of old clay near one doorway, a detail that struck the survey team more than almost anything else they uncovered, since it made the whole close, suddenly, a home rather than a curiosity. A doll's arm, missing its body, was found only a few feet from those small prints, and no one on the team needed telling what the two finds, set side by side, most likely meant. Some details need no explanation at all. They simply sit quietly and let the listener supply the rest. And still, beneath that ordinary picture, one question kept surfacing among those doing the work, quiet but persistent. The same question that had followed the vaults on South Bridge only chapters ago. If daily life here was so unremarkable, so thoroughly domestic, why was the close left untouched for 300 years, rather than simply built over, cleared and forgotten in the usual way that cities forget their older streets? Other closes nearby had been demolished, their stone reused, their memory erased by the ordinary churn of a growing city. Mary King's Close was not demolished. It was buried deliberately beneath the weight of new civic building, its rooms left standing rather than leveled, its hearths left cold rather than dismantled. That choice, made by builders working above rather than through, has never been fully explained by any surviving record. Some called it convenience, since burying was cheaper than clearing, the lower walls simply strong enough to bear a new foundation without the cost of removing them first. Others were less sure convenience alone accounted for a decision to leave so much intact rather than stripped for its stone, and pointed instead to older, quieter reasons the builders may never have written down. Whatever the reasoning, the result was a street preserved almost by accident, a household frozen mid-rhythm rather than erased, its fires banked, its shoes tucked beneath its stairs, its combs and candle stubs left exactly where a hand had last set them down. And so, it waited, patiently, under Edinburgh's later floors, through centuries of footsteps it could not hear and daylight it could not see, for someone, eventually, to come back down with a torch and start writing its story again, softly, the way a story like this deserves to be told. Perhaps it was only cost. Perhaps it was something closer to reluctance, an unwillingness among those doing the building to disturb rooms that still felt, somehow, occupied. Either way, the close kept its silence a little longer, patient as stone always is, until the moment finally came to let the daylight back in. Beneath the castle rock, where the volcanic stone drops sheer to the gardens below, there is a set of vaults that most visitors never see. And if you stand at the entrance, you can feel the air change before you take a single step inside. It is cooler there. It carries the faint mineral breath of old stone and older damp, the kind of chill that seems to remember something rather than simply hold a temperature. These chambers were carved into the rock itself, hollowed to serve the castle's soldiers and stores. And for a stretch of years around the turn of the 19th century, they held a very different population entirely. Prisoners of the Napoleonic Wars were kept down here, French and other captured sailors and soldiers, packed into low rooms, lit by little more than a candle stub, and whatever grey daylight found its way through narrow gaps above. 1796 is the year records first note prisoners of war held within the castle's vaulted spaces, and the numbers only grew as the fighting continued across the channel and beyond it. By some counts, several thousand men passed through these rooms in the years that followed, arriving in waves as ships were taken and crews marched north under guard along cold, unfamiliar roads. Some had never seen Scotland before that march, and would leave it when they finally did leave it, having known only the inside of a vault and the small patch of sky visible from an exercise yard hemmed in by high walls. Picture the scene gently, because it deserves gentleness rather than horror. Men far from home, waiting out a war they had not chosen, keeping their hands busy because idle hands in a cold vault make the hours longer and the homesickness sharper. They carved. They worked scraps of bone, wood, and even straw into small ships and boxes and trinkets, sold sometimes to guards or curious visitors for a little coin. And some of that patient effort went further, straight into the stone walls themselves. Names, initials, a ship's outline, its rigging picked out in confident, patient lines by someone who clearly knew rope and sail and missed both terribly. Some of this graffiti survives even now, faint under generations of soot and whitewash, waiting for a torch beam to find it at just the right angle. A curved hull here, a set of letters there, weathered nearly smooth, belonging to a man whose name we can still read, but whose face and fate we cannot recover. It is a strange kind of monument, made not to be found, but simply to pass an evening, and yet it has outlasted the war that put those hands into that cold room in the first place. Historians have matched some names against muster rolls, against prisoner registers kept in French and British archives alike, and a handful of stories have come forward this way, threads pulled gently from a very old tangle. One record speaks of a sailor who carved a small, full-rigged vessel and initials that were later traced to a ship taken off the Flemish coast. Though what became of the man himself afterward is simply not recorded anywhere anyone has found. A researcher spent months chasing that single set of initials through parish registers and naval lists, only to have the trail end quietly at a discharge date with no destination written beside it. The man simply walking out of the record and into ordinary, unrecorded life. Most of the marks remain wholly anonymous, a signature without a biography attached, and that is somehow more moving than a name with tidy dates on either side of it. The vaults held these men through cold winters and damp summers, through news of battles won and lost an ocean and a sea away, food often scarce and rations argued over. And when peace finally came in 1815, the rooms slowly emptied, the fires went cold, and the heavy doors were shut behind the last man to leave them. For a long while afterward, the vaults returned to quieter, more ordinary use, forgotten by most beyond the garrison that still walked past their doorways daily. Later still, in the Victorian era, the rooms found new purpose again as stores and workshops, and later again as a curiosity for visitors, led through by candle and later by electric bulb, though the guides of that time knew only fragments of what had truly happened within these particular walls. What is less often told, and perhaps deserves telling more, is that these Napoleonic vaults were not the oldest workings under the rock, nor anywhere close to the only ones cut into it. The castle sits atop a volcanic plug that has been quarried, tunneled and hollowed for centuries before any French prisoner ever ducked beneath its low, curved ceilings. Older passages run beneath and beside the known vaults, some barely documented at all, some noted only in passing by antiquarians who explored with a lantern and a notebook and left frustratingly brief, half-finished accounts behind them. A garrison this old accumulates layers the way a shoreline slowly accumulates silt, one use built quietly over another, and nobody kept a single tidy map of it all as the centuries went past, each new occupant trusting memory and habit over paper and ink. Storerooms became prison rooms, became storage again, and storage in turn became something else once more. A passage cut for one purpose in one century found itself repurposed, blocked, or simply forgotten in the next, its original function dissolving gradually into rumour and guesswork among the men who still worked above it. Soldiers stationed here across the 1700s and 1800s left their own scattered notes and diary entries, mentioning chambers that modern surveys have struggled to place precisely against what stands and can be measured today. Some of those older spaces may well connect to passages already carefully mapped and lit for visitors. Some may not connect to anything currently understood at all, sealed quietly behind stone that has not moved in a very long time. One 18th century account, written by an officer with time on his hands and a fondness for exploring, describes ducking through a low gap behind a storeroom and following a rough-cut passage until his candle guttered and good sense turned him back toward daylight. He never returned to finish the exploration, and whatever lay beyond that guttering candle has never, as far as anyone can say for certain, been properly recorded since. Engineers doing routine maintenance on the rock's drainage and structural supports have, more than once, found voids where the surviving plans insisted there should be solid, unbroken stone. Small, unmarked chambers, barely large enough for a man to stand upright in, holding nothing but settled dust and cold. Still air that has clearly sat undisturbed for a very long time indeed. There is something quietly unsettling, in the gentlest possible sense of that word, about a fortress this studied, this photographed, this walked by millions of visitors every single year, still holding pockets that resist a confident, tidy answer. The stone keeps its own record, and it releases that record slowly on its own schedule, largely regardless of how many careful surveys are run against it. Historians and archaeologists return to the vaults periodically, often prompted by conservation work rather than pure curiosity alone, and each time they tend to note much the same thing. Instruments have improved with every decade, The surveys grow finer, the readings sharper, and yet the answers they return still feel more like new questions dressed carefully as data. What has been mapped clearly does not account for everything the rock actually contains beneath its familiar surface. Ground-penetrating surveys hint at additional voids beneath the upper courtyards, spaces that correspond to nothing at all in the written record. Not a storeroom, not a well, not a passage anyone ever thought to describe on paper. Whether these are simply quarrying scars, natural fissures widened long ago for some practical use, now entirely lost to memory, or something built with a quieter intention nobody troubled to write down, remains genuinely open to this day. A conservator working on the vaults some years ago described the feeling plainly. You survey a wall you believe you understand completely, tap it out of habit more than expectation, and hear an echo where solid stone ought to answer back instead. It happens rarely, but it happens often enough that nobody in that line of work quite dismisses it as imagination anymore. The honest answer, offered by more than one specialist over the years, is that nobody currently knows the complete footprint of what lies beneath Edinburgh Castle, and that the current maps represent only our best understanding rather than any finished, final picture. It is a strange thought to carry, that somewhere below the crowds and the cannon and the tourists queuing patiently for the gift shop, there are spaces that have not been walked in living memory, chambers that last held candlelight before anyone now alive was even born. The Napoleonic vaults, at least, have given up most of their story quite willingly, in the way an old letter gives up its meaning once someone finally troubles to read it properly by better light. Their carvings can be traced gently, patiently, one ship and one initial at a time. Their dates can be checked against paperwork still sitting quietly in archive boxes not far away, waiting for the right researcher on the right afternoon. But the rock around them, older and far less talkative, keeps its own quieter counsel still. And for now, it seems entirely content to let the newer history stand in front of it, like a curtain drawn gently across a room whose far corners nobody has quite reached yet. Perhaps, in time, someone will draw that curtain fully back. For tonight, it is enough to know the room is there, patient in the dark, keeping whatever it keeps a little longer. Beneath the ordinary village of Gilmerton, on the quiet southern edge of Edinburgh, there is a set of rooms that should not, by any reasonable account, exist. Step down through a low doorway cut straight into sandstone, and the noise of the street falls away almost at once. The chambers open one into another, low-ceilinged and cool, the stones still bearing the marks of the tool that shaped it. Nothing here was built in the ordinary sense. It was carved patiently out of solid rock, the way a sculptor might work a single block rather than raise walls and set a roof. There are benches worked directly from the stone, long enough for several people to sit together in the dark. There is a table, also stone, flat and deliberate, as though someone meant guests to gather round it. And near one wall sits a round basin, hollowed with unmistakable care, that visitors have long called the punch bowl, though no one can say with certainty what it once held. Candlelight would have pooled here rather than spread, catching the ridges left by the chisel and throwing soft shadows across benches worn smooth by centuries of use. The air carries the mineral scent of old stone and something faintly of tallow, as though the memory of 1,000 candles still clings to the walls. Alcoves have been cut at odd, deliberate heights along the passage walls, too shallow for storage and too regular for accident, as though built to hold small lamps to guide a hand along the dark. A narrow channel runs beneath one bench, worn in a way that suggests water once moved through it, or perhaps was meant to, though no one has ever traced where it began or where it led. The floor itself dips gently toward the entrance, a slope so subtle most visitors never notice it, yet deliberate enough that rain, were it ever to reach this far, would find its own way back out into the world above. Whoever cut these rooms left no ledger, no inscription, no signature. They left only the work itself, and the work asks more questions than it answers. The traditional account names a single man, George Patterson, a village blacksmith, said to have carved the whole cove alone around the year 1700, over the course of 5 long years. It is a tidy story, the kind that settles comfortably into a guidebook, and it has been repeated so often that many visitors arrive already believing it as settled fact. But look closely, and the story loosens at every seam. 5 years is not very long to hollow out an entire suite of interconnected rooms from sandstone, using hand tools alone, working, presumably, around the ordinary demands of a trade that already filled his days at the forge. No contemporary record confirms the date with any precision, and no document explains why a working blacksmith would undertake something so vast and so purposeless in the eyes of his neighbours. Local tradition adds a further curious detail that Patterson used the cove afterward as a smithy and a drinking den, receiving customers underground rather than above. That detail may be true, or it may be a later embellishment stitched onto an older mystery to give it a comfortable ending, a face and a name where none had existed before. The tools required, the sheer volume of stone removed, and the total absence of any surviving plan or record all sit awkwardly against the neat 5-year timeline. Patterson may well have used the cove. Whether he alone created it is another matter entirely, and the gap between using a space and carving it from raw rock is wide enough to hold a mystery of its own. Parish records from Gilmerton in that period are thin at the best of times, scattered across the centuries by fire, damp, and simple neglect. And blacksmiths, however skilled, rarely left behind the kind of paper trail that might settle a question like this one. What survives is mostly memory passed mouth to mouth across generations, softened and shaped a little more with each retelling, until the story fits neatly on a single plaque by the entrance. That neatness is worth noticing. A genuine, unwitnessed feat of solitary labour rarely survives history so tidily. Some historians favour a far more practical explanation: smuggling. Edinburgh, in the centuries after the cove's likely creation, was a city thick with contraband, its wynds and cellars long used to move goods past the reach of customs officers, and a set of hidden chambers beneath a village on its edge would have suited that trade admirably. Coal, salt, brandy, tea, all carried heavy duties, and men with something to hide had every reason to prefer stone rooms that no tax collector would think to search. The cove sits conveniently close to old routes leading toward the coast, and its narrow entrance, easily concealed or blocked, would have made it simple to control who came and went. A hidden room beneath a blacksmith's forge, moreover, offered the perfect cover story, since strangers moving in and out of a working smithy at odd hours would draw far less notice than strangers slipping into open fields after dark. Yet the theory cannot fully explain the punch bowl, the seating for several people at once. or the sheer comfort built into spaces that smuggling alone would not require. Men hiding barrels of brandy have little need of a table carved for conversation. The smuggling explanation accounts for the secrecy well enough, but it struggles still to account for the hospitality. A second theory turns towards secrecy of another kind altogether: religious or political concealment. Scotland's 17th and 18th centuries were thick with divided loyalties, Covenanter and Jacobite sympathies, moving in and out of favour depending on who held power that year. And a hidden underground space would have offered obvious shelter to those needing to meet, worship, or simply disappear from view. Gatherings that could not safely happen above ground might easily have happened below it, sealed behind stone and shielded from prying eyes. Some who favour this theory point to the layout itself. The benches arranged for a group rather than for solitary labour, as evidence of assembly rather than commerce. A room built for sitting together, after all, suggests conversation, and conversation of the wrong kind in the wrong century could carry real danger. Yet, here again, the evidence resists a clean answer, since no document links the cove to any specific meeting, sect, or plot, and the theory rests more on plausibility than proof. It fits the mood of the space rather better than it fits any known fact, which is precisely the trouble with a mystery this old, that plausibility and proof are rarely the same thing. And Gilmerton offers plenty of the first, while withholding almost all of the second. A third possibility looks earlier still, toward hermitage rather than hiding. Some suggest the cove may once have sheltered a religious recluse, a hermit seeking distance from the world in an age when such withdrawal was neither unusual nor discouraged, choosing solid rock over a modest hut precisely for its permanence and its silence. Carved stone does not rot, does not draw a landlord's attention, and does not require the constant repair a timber dwelling would demand, all of which suited a life meant to be simple, enclosed, and largely unwitnessed by the village above. The scale of the work, patient and unhurried, would suit a single devoted life stretched across years, rather than a rushed or secretive undertaking, each chamber added as need or reflection required. Chalk marks and worn edges throughout the chambers hint at long repeated use rather than a single burst of construction, the kind of wear that accumulates only across a very long habitation. Still, nothing found within the cove. No cross, no altar, no inscription of devotion confirms this reading outright, and the theory remains a plausible shape pressed onto an otherwise silent space, comforting in its simplicity but no more provable than its rivals. A fourth line of thought reaches earlier still, suggesting the chambers may predate the Paterson legend by a considerable stretch, perhaps carved sometime in the medieval period or even earlier, and merely reused, rediscovered, or reshaped by later occupants across the centuries, who left their own marks atop work that was already old when they arrived. Tool marks in different sections of the cove appear, to some observers, to vary subtly in style and depth, as though more than one hand, working in more than one era, shaped these rooms over a much longer span than any single lifetime could account for. If true, the 1700 date attached to Paterson would mark not the cove's creation, but merely its last recorded use, one chapter set atop others long since forgotten and unrecorded, their makers and purposes lost entirely to time. This would make Gilmerton Cove not a single mystery, but a layered one, each generation adding its own unexplained chapter to chambers whose true beginning may lie far deeper in the past than any surviving record can reach, folded into centuries that left no names behind at all. What remains, after all the theories are laid side by side, is not a solution, but a genuinely open question, and there is something almost restful in that. Gilmerton Cove has never surrendered its answer to smugglers, historians, or curious visitors carrying lanterns down that same low doorway. And it may never do so. The stone keeps its silence the way it has for centuries, patient, cool, and unhurried, exactly as it did the night it was first carved by hands whose names have long since slipped from memory. Above, the village goes on much as villages do, unaware, or perhaps quietly proud, of what waits beneath its ordinary streets. And that thread, the sense of something still unresolved directly under the ground we walk, will carry us gently onward, deeper into Edinburgh's hidden wynds, where other doorways wait, just as patient, just as quiet, for someone willing to ask what lies beneath. Come back now to Nidri Street, and you find yourself standing directly above the tangle you have been walking through all along. Beneath the paving here run the same brick-vaulted chambers that once held butchers and cobblers and families crowded into rented gloom. The South Bridge vaults do not stop where the bridge itself stops. They spread outward unevenly, the way water finds the low ground, rather than the straight line an engineer might prefer. At points, they connect to other cellars and cavities threaded beneath the old town, a honeycomb no single map has ever fully captured. Not then, and not now. Some passages are blocked by later building work, bricked over almost carelessly by builders working in a hurry, with barely a thought spared for whoever might come looking later. Some simply end in rubble, their far side unknown even now, unexplored by choice or by simple lack of funding. Stand in one of these chambers and the ceiling curves low overhead, ribbed like the inside of something that once, long ago, breathed. Damp gathers on the brick in a fine, cold sheen that never quite dries, whatever the season above. Somewhere close, traffic hums on the modern street overhead, utterly unaware of the hollow ground beneath its wheels, unaware that a whole second city waits just beyond the tarmac. This is not one single vault system so much as a scattering of separate ones, built at different times for different purposes by builders who rarely gave much thought to what lay next door or beneath. Records from the period barely mention the vaults at all, as though nobody involved in building South Bridge expected the space underneath to matter to anyone. And that gap in the record, more than any single tunnel or chamber, is the truth the whole city keeps quietly circling back to. Edinburgh was never built once, cleanly, and then simply left standing. It was built again and again, on top of itself, layer folding over layer, until the boundary between one century's floor and another century's ceiling grew almost impossible to draw with any real confidence. Surveyors who have mapped small sections of the vaults describe an odd sensation of losing direction entirely underground, the compass of the surface streets becoming useless the moment stone closes overhead. A chamber that should, by any reasonable logic, sit beneath one particular shop instead turns out to run beneath the 1-2 doors along. Nobody planned it that way. It simply happened, the slow accident of centuries of separate builders working blind to one another's foundations. Above ground, the wynds tell the same layered story in narrower, steeper form. These were the closes and alleys that once threaded the spine of the Royal Mile, dropping sharply downhill toward the loch that used to lie where tidy gardens now stretch green and orderly instead. Many of those wynds still exist today, visible, walkable, their worn stone steps polished smooth by centuries of passing shoes and centuries of rain. But others were simply swallowed whole. When the new bridges and terraces rose through the 1700s, whole wynds were built directly over rather than cleared away. Their lower reaches sealed beneath grand new structures the city wanted visitors and travellers to admire. Walk along Nidri Street today, and you are, in a very real sense, walking on the roof of what came before you. The wynd itself did not vanish from the earth. It was simply buried, given a new ceiling of stone and brick, and left to keep its own private time down in the dark. Historians tracing old property deeds have turned up named closes that correspond to nothing at all visible on the surface now, addresses that survive only as ghosts on paper, their actual stones sitting somewhere below your feet as you read this. A resident here once described feeling the temperature drop sharply near one particular cellar door for no reason she could ever explain to anyone, and she never opened that door again for the rest of her life. Whether that account is memory, exaggeration, or invention hardly matters in the end. The street keeps the story regardless, the way old streets have always kept their stories, quietly, without asking permission. Old maps drawn before the 1700s show wynds by the dozen running down toward the water, narrow as a shoulder's width in places, crowded with tenement stairs stacked 6 and 7 stories high. Compare one of those maps against the street plan of today, laid carefully side by side, and entire named passages simply stop existing partway down the page, swallowed by later ink as surely as they were swallowed by later stone. Draw the threads together now, gently, because in truth, they were never really separate strands at all. The plague of 1645 drove the frightened and the desperate into exactly this kind of buried, airless space. Sealed doors meant as mercy becoming, for some unlucky souls, something far closer to a tomb. The vaults themselves were raised not for secrecy in the first place, but for ordinary storage, cellars beneath a bridge built to solve a very practical problem of steep ground and awkward city planning. Damp and recurring flooding turned those same cellars unusable for honest trade soon enough. And so they became something else entirely, home to those the polished surface city had no proper room for. When conditions down there grew genuinely intolerable, the vaults were walled shut, not from outright cruelty exactly, but from a kind of slow civic forgetting, where out of sight was quietly treated as the same thing as solved. 1994 brought a workman's pickaxe through old brick and back into daylight, a hidden world that had waited more than a century simply to be noticed again. Mary King's Close showed the wider city how an entire street could be swallowed whole by later construction, and yet preserved almost perfectly in the very act of swallowing it. The castle's own deep vaults held prisoners of old wars within sandstone walls that still carry initials scratched by patient, restless hands, centuries gone now. Gilmerton Cove offered chambers carved by slow, patient tools into solid living rock, their true original purpose still argued over today by people who study such places for a living and still cannot agree. Each of these places, different in age and shape and original use, shares one quiet inheritance in common. A city that built downward as readily as it ever built upward, and then, again and again, chose simply to forget what it had built there, Nidri Street sits precisely at the meeting point of all of it. Bridge above, buried wind below, plague and poverty and rediscovery folded together into the same few hundred quiet meters of stone. Walk its short length above ground, and nothing announces the depth of what lies beneath your feet. No plaque, no obvious seam in the paving. Nothing but ordinary stone, doing an entirely ordinary job of holding up an entirely ordinary street. That, perhaps, is the quietest detail of all. The most layered ground in the whole of the old town looks, from the surface, exactly like every other stretch of pavement around it. What remains unexplained is not any single vault or any single close on its own, but the shape of the whole tangled thing, still not fully known even to the people who study it most closely. New sections are occasionally found even now, opened by simple chance during ordinary building work, surprising everyone involved every single time. No complete map of the network exists, and perhaps none ever truly will, given how readily the city kept building over its own foundations without ever pausing to record what exactly it was covering. Ground-penetrating surveys done in recent decades have traced faint voids beneath streets nowhere near Nidri Street or Southbridge at all. Hollow pockets nobody has yet opened, their contents entirely unknown. Some may be nothing more than old drains or forgotten coal cellars. A few, surveyors admit quietly, do not match any recorded structure whatsoever, and nobody has yet found the nerve, or perhaps simply the funding, to dig carefully down and look. So the city keeps its ledger only partly written, one column of names and dates set neatly against another column left entirely blank. And the blank column, oddly, is the one that holds the listener's attention longest. Standing on Nidri Street at night, with the tourist shops shuttered and the old stone gone quiet, it becomes easy to feel the layers underfoot rather than merely know about them in some distant intellectual way. The candlelight tours tend to end here for a reason, guides will tell you, because this is where the different threads of the whole story visibly overlap. Vault meeting, wind meeting cellar meeting, ordinary street above. A last soft mystery lingers quietly before the final chapter closes the account properly, the way any good bedtime story saves its gentlest note for last. Somewhere beneath this exact patch of pavement, unlisted on any surviving deed anywhere, sits at least one small chamber whose original purpose nobody now alive can name with any real certainty. It waits the way old stone always waits, patient, undisturbed, keeping its own particular silence a little while longer yet. Rest now, if you can, with that small unfinished thought still turning over quietly in the dark until the last few careful steps of this quiet investigation draw everything gently, finally, to a close. Think for a moment of everything that still lies unmapped beneath the old town. Edinburgh has been surveyed and resurveyed, mapped in ink and mapped again in laser light, and still the surveyors admit that whole stretches of the rock remain unaccounted for. Somewhere under the tenements, under the tourist shops selling tartan and shortbread, there are voids that no plan has ever fully recorded. Nobody claims to know exactly how many. Estimates drift depending on who is asked, and the honest answer, given quietly, is simply that nobody has finished looking, and perhaps nobody ever truly will. Ground-penetrating radar finds a hollow here, a corridor there, and then the funding runs out, or the building above proves too fragile to disturb, and the survey stops mid-sentence, its findings filed and its questions left open. The city keeps a mental map with entire pages torn out. Chambers under the Cowgate, passages under the Canongate, a cellar reported by one shopkeeper in the 1970s and never mentioned again, as though the memory of it simply closed over, the way soil closes over a footprint left in a wet field. Each of these spaces, if it exists, sits in darkness tonight, its temperature holding steady, its air undisturbed, waiting the way stone waits, without impatience, without any sense that centuries are passing at all. Engineers who work on the old town's foundations speak of this quietly among themselves, almost affectionately, the way sailors speak of a sea they have only partly charted. They say the rock remembers more than the records do. They say every new development, every basement extension, every utility trench dug for a new pipe risks opening onto a space nobody expected, and that this has happened often enough that contractors now half expect it. And this, more than any single mystery examined tonight, is what Edinburgh actually keeps in the dark. Not one vault, not one bricked doorway, but an entire unfinished ledger of the city's own underside, added to slowly, corrected rarely, and never in any human lifetime likely to be closed. Archivists who work with the old council minutes describe a similar pattern on paper. A committee notes a concern about a cellar in one decade, and the matter simply vanishes from the record in the next, with no resolution ever logged. Whether that silence means the problem was solved, or merely forgotten, or quietly sealed away without further comment from anyone involved at the time, the paper itself will not say. It sits there, mute, the way the stone above it sits, offering no more than it was ever asked to keep. What is striking, once you have followed this long descent from the drained loch to the vaults to the cove, is how often the city chose the very same response. Seal it, wall it. Let the record note a hazard or a subsidence or a structural concern, and let that note stand quietly in for an explanation nobody wished to give in full. The plague houses on the Cowgate were sealed, whatever precisely became of the families shut inside them. The South Bridge vaults were closed off behind brick, whatever else the council might have claimed at the time. Blackfriars was built over rather than properly excavated, its stones folded into later foundations. Gilmerton Cove was chained rather than studied. For the better part of 2 centuries, its silence treated almost as a kind of answer in itself. Time and again, when the choice arrived between confronting a difficult space and simply putting a wall between the city and that space, Edinburgh chose the wall and rarely left behind much reasoning for why. It is easy, from this distance, to call that neglect or fear or plain civic convenience, and probably it was some shifting mixture of all three, differently weighted in each generation that inherited the problem. But there is another way to read it, gentler and perhaps just as true. A city, like a person, sometimes needs to close a door before it can go on living comfortably above it. Sealing was not always concealment for its own sake, though it may look that way now. Sometimes it was simply a tired way of saying, we cannot deal with this properly today, and trusting almost against the evidence that someone, someday, might. The 1994 rediscovery of South Bridge suggests that trust was not entirely misplaced, even if it took longer than anyone sealing that brick could ever have reasonably imagined. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson underneath all of it. What gets sealed rarely disappears. It only waits patiently for a generation willing to look again. And it is worth noticing how rarely that willingness arrives on schedule. It came for South Bridge only by accident, when a builder happened to break through in the wrong place at the right moment. It has not yet come for Gilmerton, or for whatever else still sits behind the Cowgate's quieter walls. Discovery in this city has never been a matter of patient planning, so much as a matter of someone eventually stumbling into the dark with a torch and a reason to keep walking. And here, at the very end, the account returns to where it first began. A doorway, low and half hidden, set into a wall on a street you have probably walked without ever noticing. It is still there tonight. It was there before this recording started, and it will be there long after it ends, entirely unchanged by anything that has been said about it in the meantime. We still do not know, with any real certainty, who sealed it, or precisely when, or what reason moved whoever did it to choose brick over explanation. The old ledger that might once have answered these questions has never surfaced, and it may never surface at all, filed away somewhere, or lost, or simply never written down in the first place. What we know instead is smaller and, in its own quiet way, more honest than any theory could be. The door is real. The wall behind it is real. Somewhere past that wall, whether chamber or passage or simple settled rubble, something has been sitting undisturbed in the dark for longer than anyone now living can verify. That is the whole of it, when every embellishment is stripped away. Not a solution, only a fact, patient and unresolved, resting exactly as it was when this story first paused at that threshold, and exactly as it will likely rest long after tonight. Historians will keep proposing explanations, each one reasonable, none of them provable, and the door will keep its silence through every proposal offered to it, unmoved by any theory built to fit its outline. Some will say plague. Some will say debt, or scandal, or simple structural fatigue. The least romantic answer, and perhaps the most likely one. It hardly matters which visitor believes which version, walking past it on a damp evening with a guidebook in hand. The door does not adjust itself to suit the story being told about it. It simply remains, brick and timber and old iron, holding its position the way it has held it for 300 years, indifferent to whichever explanation happens to be fashionable this season. There will always be more beneath Edinburgh than any single account can hold, and that, oddly enough, is not an unsettling thought so much as a companionable one. Cities are allowed their unfinished chapters, their sealed rooms, their small, unclaimed silences, and the old town wears its buried layers the way old stone wears frost, without any need to explain itself to the people walking above. Perhaps that is the gentlest way to leave it tonight. Not with an answer closing the door, but with the door simply staying exactly where it has always been, unhurried, unopened, keeping its own quiet company with whatever waits patiently behind it. Somewhere above it, the city goes on exactly as it always has. Footsteps crossing the close, lamplight settling over wet cobbles, the ordinary evening folding itself gently around an extraordinary silence underneath. Shops close for the night, windows dim one by one along the row. Somewhere a bell marks an hour nobody is really counting anymore. And if you should ever find yourself walking those streets after dark, past a low doorway you cannot quite place, you might feel just faintly that the ground beneath your feet remembers far more than it has ever chosen to tell you, or anyone. Let that be enough for now. Let the stone keep its own long hours, the mist keep its own soft shape over the rooftops, and let Edinburgh, layer upon patient layer, settle quietly back into sleep, keeping its doorway closed, keeping its ledger unfinished, keeping its dark exactly as it likes to keep it. Somewhere below the sound of your own breathing slowing, that same rock is holding its silence still, holding it the way it always has, and it will go on holding it long after this candle gutters and this room falls quiet. There is nothing left to solve tonight. There is only the stone, the mist, the closed door, and the soft, unhurried dark folding itself once more around the old city and around you until morning.